among some of the favorite mangas that I like to read. One of them happens to be The 7 Deadly Sins. And if you know anything about 7 Deadly Sins, you would know that this anime got completely shafted after season 2. Even worse than this, if you're in the loop with the next series after this, The 4 Nights of the Apocalypse, you would know that a very prominent character, being Jericho, is in fact in love with this nigga's son.
What the fuck?
And understandably, a lot of people are quite upset about this fact. But what if I were to tell you that Jericho is not the only sex offender within this series? Today, just like the anime, I will now shaft one of my favorite series by explaining why every single member of the 7 Deadly Sins are top tier elite sex offenders that would make people like EDP bow within their presence. First of all, we must talk about the strongest of the 7 Deadly Sins, the dragon sin of wrath, Meliodas. One thing that you need to know about Meliodas is that he is an elite class groper. His groping skills go so great that he's able to touch multiple parts of a woman's body within a few milliseconds. He also seems to have sneak level 100, as he is easily able to gaze upon a woman's knickers without having any sort of repercussions afterwards. His knowledge of the human female body is so vast that he is instantly able to deduce a woman's very special sizes, that being her bust, waist, and hip size. If you ask me, Dragon Sin of Wrath, Meliodas, is truly the king of sexual harassment. And it's even worse when we start to consider Elizabeth. Basically from both episode and chapter 1, Elizabeth basically does whatever the fuck Meliodas wants. Meaning if Meliodas wants to give him that Dragon Sin D, there is a 95% chance that Elizabeth will say yes. This also means that there's actually a good chance as well that Meliodas has committed statutory rape. This gives Meliodas a good old case of ephebophilia, since Elizabeth at this point in time is 16 years old and Meliodas is 3,000 years plus. However, we can actually promote this even further. You see, due to lore reasons, Elizabeth is the reincarnation of a goddess. Every time she dies, she's basically reincarnated 5 seconds later, and Meliodas usually finds out almost right away. It's to the point where Meliodas is extremely protective of her woman. In fact, upon her latest reincarnation, Meliodas literally says to Zarathos, who got penetrated like an Epstein Island resident, "Stay the fuck away from my woman." Meaning Meliodas is promoted from ephebophilia to good old-fashioned pedophilia. Be prepared to hear that word a lot in this video. Moving on to Fox Sin of Greed, Bon. Whenever Bon gets into an altercation between himself and a woman, Bon for some reason always seems to strip that woman down. That is easily sexual harassment. However, this gets even worse for Bon when we bring in the Elaine stuff. It doesn't take a genius to realize that while Elaine is probably 100 plus years old, she looks like she is a 12-year-old girl. If you were in the 7 Deadly Sins universe, you would most definitely hear Bon say something like this.
Man, it doesn't matter if she's 15, my nigga. I like young girls. I like them 15, 14, 16. I like them real young, my nigga. I don't like women in their 20s. All the girls in the 20s, I'm cool with them, girl. I like fucking girls like 15.
The series even goes so far as to try and replace Elaine with pre-pedophile arc Jericho. And Bond still prefers Elaine. He likes small titties. That is indicative of a pedophile. Grizzly Sin of Sloth. Fairy King Harlequin is a pedophile. Unlike Meliodas and Bond, Harlequin does not perform overtly sexual and vile acts, but for him we actually have to go deeper. Harlequin's first few experiences with serpent sin Diane is that of romance. However, unfortunately for Harlequin, Diane at this point in time is basically the equivalent of a giant toddler. You could almost say that King's relationship with Diane goes from babysitter to lover. Harlequin's level of pedophilia is even on the same level as Sanji from One Piece's pedophilia. serpent sin of envy, Diane, is also a pedophile. Diane's pedophilia does not in fact stem from her love of Harlequin, but it actually stems from her previous love of Meliodas. Diane is kind of the same thing as Bon, where Meliodas, throughout the entirety of the story, is called a child by basically everyone who doesn't know his true age. This means that Diane is basically in love with a 14-year-old boy. Pedophile. Goat's sin of lust, Gowther. His sin is literally that of vile sexual acts. Upon gaining a free will of his own, his literal first act is befriending the King of Leonis' sister, who at this point in time is a 16-year-old girl. And if you don't know, Gowther, much like Meliodas, is 3,000 years plus in age. Their friendship turns into romance as they literally fuck. But then the sister dies of literal magical tuberculosis, and Gowther becomes so stricken with grief that he cuts his chest open, rips out his heart, then cuts out the sister's chest open, and then places his heart in there to try and get her to live again. This is basically an erotic murder. Therefore, not only is Gowther a pure, twisted psychopath and erotic serial killer, he is also a pedophile. Boar sin of gluttony, Merlin. If you were to gaze at Merlin's pure choice of fashion, you would know that she literally commits indecent exposure in literally every panel she's in. As usual, it gets even worse. For those of you who dropped the anime, at one point in time, Merlin was actually in love with Meliodas. And if you already watched the Diane portion, you already know what I'm about to say here. Pedophile. And finally, the last sin, whose charges are personally the easiest to challenge. Escanor's sexual deviousness comes from his love of Merlin. Now, why would Escanor loving Merlin be a huge problem? You see, Merlin is chronologically 3,000 plus years old, but biologically, she is in fact 12 years old, meaning that Escanor is in fact in love with a 12-year-old child. Now, I personally believe this is somewhat different, because unlike the other sins, Escanor does not know Merlin is 12 years old. However, looking back at it now, over the course of 5 minutes, I've realized that Escanor is in fact still guilty, because he then learns that Merlin is in fact 12 years old, and Escanor becomes very sad that he has to watch Merlin transform herself back into a grown-ass woman, meaning that Escanor is in fact a pedophile. That's right, folks. The 7 deadly sins is clearly just a pack of pedophiles. Arguably, Hawk the Pig is the cleanest and purest member of that entire group, as he clearly does no sexual acts. Thus, the moral of the story is, if you somehow plan on jacking off to a 7 deadly sins character, make sure that that character is over the age of 18, physically looks over the age of 18, and is not a pedophile. Thank you.